Thanks so much, Marie.
Hi. Do you prefer SARK or Susan? Does it matter?
I'm definitely representing the entity that's known as SARK, and I think that's the one that people are most familiar with, so happy to be called SARK.
Wonderful. So I just played that HIV/AIDS campaign, and it really made me think of your book, Glad No Matter What, because it's about finding the opportunities in those incredible challenges and finding new ways and new perspectives to look at things. So can you take us through a bit of the process? So someone would read the book and they would look at the feelings menu and see how they're feeling, and then they go in and they do an exercise. So can you give us an example of one of the exercises they might do?
Sure. There's a process I show in the book that I invented some years ago. And by the way, everything I write about are all things that I use and utilize myself. So I'm like a human experiment. So I just want to make that clear. And so this particular process is called three-part harmony. So it's really a way. It also could be called Mad, Wise, Glad pages. But it's a way to write down how you feel and honor and respect that. So there's a part one where you write down how you feel. This is all, of course, described in detail in the book. And then part two is where you you use your awakened wise self. And some people could call it your higher self. And your wise self reframes all the things that you just wrote that you're upset about. So it's a way of retraining the brain to witness your feelings and emotions and give you something to do with them, especially people who aren't, a lot of people just aren't familiar with doing anything with their feelings. They just sort of have them, but they don't know what they are, and it's kind of like this underground thing. And this brings it out to the light, and it brings it up for healing, and it can happen very quickly in this process. Oh, and then that clears the way for part three, which are the glad pages. So it reminds you of what you are glad about. And there's lots of different ways this process can be used. I sometimes just use part one just to get some angry or upset or worried thoughts out, not just thoughts but feelings. But let me give an example of the wise self, because I want everyone to know how powerful that part is inside of everyone. And it's inside of everyone, by the way. So everyone has a wise self, a higher self, and the abilities that this has to, when you do some writing like this with a process like three-part harmony. Like I said, it retrains your brain, and what it does actually is give your wise self a chance to be with you all the time, not just when you're writing. So your wise self will start to speak up in your life in actual incidents that are occurring. So a fresh example from my life is that I was recently informed in the United States with the IRS that I was being audited. And
that's scary.
Yeah. It's scary, and it's something I had dreaded, ever since I paid taxes. And so I utilized my wise self to guide me in how to best prepare for this audit. And I'll just jump to the end and tell you that because of this, I experienced a magical IRS audit.
And
And
that sounds rare.
Yes, and I'm so happy because I really have transformed that energy now, and I'm able to help others. I've been consulting with other people who've been audited and are feeling very scared and very off balance and worried and all those kinds of feelings. And so I've started just kind of informally, but I'm probably going to do something in writing so that other people can, here's what to do if you're audited from a metaphysical and spiritual perspective. So that was one, and then the other one is perhaps more pointed is the incident where I was being picked up to come to British Columbia, to come to Vancouver, and the car and driver was late, and I didn't realize it till the last minute, so I got very nervous because I only had a certain amount of time to get to the airport. And then I remembered I hadn't taken out the garbage, so I ran down the service corridor to empty the garbage, and I slipped and fell. And I slipped and fell in what turned out to be cat poop.
Nice.
Yeah. So now I had cat poop on my clothes, and I had to go change. And then the driver was just pulling up, and he got out of his car, and he said, "Yeah, ride to the airport." And I said, "Do you realize you're late?" I was really upset, and he said, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Just a few minutes." And I said, "No, you really are." I said, "And now you're defensive about it." So we're basically standing, kind of having this fight on the street. And then he said, "Well, just get in the car." And I said, "No, I won't get in the car." I said, "I don't like you." I was kind of surprised that popped out. But it did. And finally I realized, well, how am I going to get to the airport? I need to get there. So eventually I got in the car. And, it's a little embarrassing to admit, but I was intensely disliking him. And I was looking at the back of his head and thinking, he is wrong and he was late. And, and I know he was doing the same thing. And then my awakened wise self spoke to me and said, "Ask him if he wants to start over." So I said, "Could we start over?" I said, "What's your name?" He said, "My name is Bill." And I said, "Bill, I would like to acknowledge that I was very crabby when you arrived, and I had just slipped and fallen in cat poop." And he said, "Well, I would like to acknowledge that I was sitting at the wrong house 10 minutes early because the dispatcher had not given me your correct address."
Aww.
And I said, "Oh, Bill," I said, "do you want to forgive each other?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Me too." By the time we got to the airport, we were crying, we were hugging, and I have Bill's home phone number.
Aw, you do? That's nice.
But it was such a great example of wise self in motion in an actual incident in life. And that's what I want this book to do, to be that kind of support system for people to take all the things that happen to us and alchemize them and transform them and have new responses instead of just being in reaction. A lot of people just have things happen and then they just react. And it's often not from a very constructive or productive place.
Definitely. Well, and I'm curious, do you recommend always solving it with the person? Because sometimes we're faced with someone who is irrational. And
well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I just had one just the other day with an irrational person. So I have a fresh example. I was being picked up after taking we have something here called BART. It's a rapid transit. I had taken it from the airport and then got into a cab and told him where I lived, and he started shouting, "That's not far enough. That's not worth my time." And he was crazy. And I just said very calmly, "Well, it sounds like you'd rather not drive me." It seemed like a good observation to make. And he slammed on the brakes so hard that I hit my head.
Oh my
and
goodness.
Then started screaming, "Get out, get out!" And then he got out and hurled my luggage onto the ground.
Wow.
And I watched my luggage just sitting there in the middle of the road, but here again, the wise self was with me, and I was absolutely undisturbed. I said to him, "Wow, you're a very angry person." I said, "I'm so sorry." I just felt so bad for him. I didn't take it personally. I wasn't afraid of him. My wise self was just right there, kind of smiling, holding my hand.